Hello, this is Jacob from Team BLRS2, and this is a breakdown of our 2023-2024 Over-Under Season Notebook. Before we get to the notebook itself, just a bit of intro stuff. The structure of this video will have chapters in the YouTube scroll bar as well as timestamps in the description, as well as the planning doc we used to make this video linked in the description, just so you can look at a text format if you don't want to watch a long video. Next, this is not really a page-by-page breakdown of the notebook, since the notebook itself is also linked in the description. We're going to be focusing on specific entries that contribute to each portion of the rubric, which is how this video will be formatted. We'll include areas of improvement we think could be made throughout the notebook in the end of the video. Next, this video is recorded before Worlds, just mainly due to tight schedules after Worlds with final exams and traveling back home, hence why there is no post-submission date content in this notebook. Next is sort of our philosophy with this notebook. We wanted to make a notebook optimized to hit as many rubric points as possible. Last season, our notebook had a lot of sort of off-topic content that really kind of bloated the notebook and dragged the overall quality down. This year, we really wanted to dial in on the rubric and make sure we had the highest scoring notebook possible. We really didn't change too much from the sort of high school notebook meta, because it's the same rubric, why change what works? So you'll notice it's not a copy of a high school notebook, but it has similar theming. And then we had an emphasis on eliminating fluff this season. Last season, we were just shy of 800 pages, whereas you can see on the PDF here, we have 315 in this notebook. This really makes it easier to find content that pertains to the rubric for the judges, as well as just making things easier to read generally. Quick word of warning to any teams that may be wanting to remove fluff: make sure not to remove fluff at the cost of making a cohesive notebook. Things like tournament recaps may seem to not have a direct rubric point they correlate to, but can easily be integrated and look a bit weird if you don't have them. We just had a lot of fluff last season. So next is how we made the notebook. We used a program called Notion to make our notebook. I won't go too much into that here because we have a page up on the BLRS wiki, which goes into how to use Notion to make a notebook. That page will also be linked in the description. And then we did use sort of entry templates to make our notebook. These did not include any text, but just consisted of a formatting for each entry type. This really helped make sure our entries were pretty consistent across the board. We'll have some entries that are better or worse than others, but the general quality remains pretty consistent throughout the notebook. So with that complete, let's move on to the table of contents. So the table of contents we just threw together in Excel. There's really nothing too much here, except that we have a few entries that are independent from any robot stuff, and then we have it split between competition and skills robots. With this coming out after Worlds, we decided to make 2 robots for the competition, and then 2 robots for the skills challenge. The skills challenge robots were developed early on, paused, and then continued after the notebook submission date, hence why those entries are not in here at this point in time. In each of the robot entries, we included which design cycle they pertain to, just so that in the rubric point that states that the design cycles must be easily identified, judges can just look at the table of contents as well as any of the entries and see that we have each design cycle represented. This, along with just chronological dates and clear titles that have the rubric point in the title, as well as testing and other things are included in the entries but may not just be in the title. With that gone, we have a team and project management section as well. This pretty much just consists of recaps of our team meetings throughout the semester. They didn't fit in too well in the robot entries just because they consisted of aspects from competition and skills, so putting them in would either have to duplicate them or only include them in one section, which doesn't lead to a consistent format, so we just decided to put them all in an appendix at the end. We'll get into those a bit more later. Those just mainly consist of team and project management points. So moving on to the identified a problem portion of the rubric, we have a few different entries we mainly use to convey these points, but we'll start off with the first few entries of our notebook. The first is a team organization and structure page. This mainly includes goals for the season. For our goals, we wanted to include things that were mainly measurable, but for the most part, these really don't come up too often. This is mainly for just having a fairly cohesive notebook that includes content beyond just rubric points, which I mentioned in the fluff section earlier, as well as how our team is formatted, and a list of our team members. The next page is an entry about the engineering design process. I made this in Canva to represent our team colors a bit better, but for the most part, we include the step of a process, a slight definition of a process. We don't go too much in detail on this, just to not load up the notebook too much, and then specifically how we implement each step. This is probably the most important part, just because it shows we're actually thinking about these and how they can be implemented in our design process, rather than just copy-pasting a list of steps from the internet. With that out of the way, that gets into our game analysis. So the game analysis is pretty typical to how you typically see, in that we have a bit of overview of the field and game elements, but before we end it, we get into some more analysis. This is probably the biggest part of our game analysis that we want to hammer home, is that you always want to include some sort of analysis along with pasting in definitions. Just pasting in definitions doesn't show any sort of analysis, so we really wanted to just make sure people understood that we are thinking about and understanding the game elements. You'll see more of that, and we did try to bold these just so those are what's being emphasized here. But beyond that, there really isn't too much differently here than you wouldn't see in a typical game analysis. Into point values, again, I made this in Canva. One additional thing to mention here is that all of our images are, or at least should be, labeled. I believe there is a point in the rubric that states that all diagrams and pictures should be labeled. That's not something I look for too much as a judge, but I know some judges who do. So it's better to be safe than sorry and make sure all of your figures are labeled. Again, more graphs I made from Canva. And then getting into some important rules and their effects. Again, this is fairly brief just because we don't want to be copy-pasting in the whole game manual, but we just take some specific rules and then give some of our implementation of why these are important. And then just some offensive, defensive strategies and main takeaways. You'll notice that our offensive and defensive strategies and takeaways bit are fairly brief. This is because we did decide early on to split into competition and skills robots. So the competition-specific analysis and the skill-specific analysis, rather than include it both in the game analysis, we split it up into the start of the competition and the start of skills, just so that these entries are still fairly easy to read. And by the time you get to skills 200 pages in, you don't forget why we chose to do skills robots. So starting with the competition entries, we'll go back to that earlier entry later. This is sort of the continuation of a game analysis where we go more into specific match strategies. We kind of structured this entry as a typical brainstorming entry, including a decision matrix, just to show that we're really considering the importances of each strategy and how we're deciding on our main one. We'll go more into depth on the template later in the brainstorming section, but it really just shows kind of generally how we decided to do things, our decision matrix, and an implementation plan. And that is more or less it for the game analysis. We have a very similar thing in the skills bots, which I'll show you after this next entry. So the next thing we decided to do to hit identify the problem rubric points is to make design briefs. These design briefs are starting off each design cycle that mainly just serve to identify the problem, constraints, and criteria, just to show that we're identifying at the start of each robot what we want that robot to do. We also include a timeline and a Gantt chart here, just so that the robot's overall timeline is identified along with our goals for the robot. And you'll notice here with the Gantt chart, we explicitly write about why we choose the dates we do, or at least what those dates really do mean for our goals, just so that it's not just pasting in a Gantt chart with no explanation. And then just to show, page 188, we do the same thing for the skills robots as far as strategies, as well as choosing a potential solution. And then for reference, here is the design brief for the start of the skills robots. So moving more specifically into our brainstorming on page 34, we begin with the chassis brainstorming for the competition robots. We start the entry off with a just fairly brief but still present identify the problem portion, just in case the previous entries weren't clear enough. We just want to be sure that the problem is restated at the start of each entry, just to make sure the point is getting across. We also make sure to include parameters for a successful design for testing we conduct later. For each brainstorming solution, we make sure to include at least 3 potential solutions at any given point, just because that is the main thing the brainstorming point on the rubric asks for. So always include 3 possible solutions. But next, we go into just a bit of detail about what each solution is and why it may help. Our brainstorming will go more into depth on things we can improve later, but probably could be a bit more detailed just to say that now. But next, we have prototyping solutions and testing. We gather testing data for each solution we prototype. This is to both help the selecting the best solution point, as it says we can select for either a decision matrix or testing. We do both. And as well as testing data, just to show that we test more than just after something's built. But you can see we have testing and then an analysis of our testing data. We'll go more into that later. But going on to the select the best solution portion, we kind of do a recap of the previous descriptions in a pros and cons table for each. These generally could be a bit more detailed as well, but given that we have explanations, these just kind of supplement that data. But moving on to our decision matrix, we describe each of the different criteria we consider in the decision matrix, what ease of the integration is, what the score, the number itself actually means, as well as the different weights we use for each criteria. This we just mainly do to give a bit more clarity to our decision matrix. When we see the different criteria we have for each design item, we just want to show the judges, we understand what pushing power is, and we want to explain that easily enough so that no information is really lost on the judges. Finally, after the decision matrix, we have our planning portion of that rubric. This is fairly brief, as a lot of this is also covered in the build section, but we try to include at least some points about what exactly we're going to be making, as well as a very brief timeline. More so just reflects the overall timeline in the design brief entry or in another type of entry we'll go into later. But it's still present and just shows we're thinking about how exactly we want to accomplish what we just decided upon. The next category on the rubric we cover in our notebook is the build and program section. So starting off the build entry, we include some general information about the design process at the start. Really nothing too major, but just kind of restating the problem we decided and talked about earlier in the brainstorming section. For our building specifically, we make sure to have clear steps, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. Because that is the main thing the build section is asking for, records the steps to build and program a solution. As well as enough detail that the reader can follow. So our steps, while they are clearly steps, do include a decent amount of detail as well, but we'll get more into the build entries in the improvement section, as this is probably the area we have the most room for improvement in our notebook, we feel like. But for the most part, it's a fairly standard build section, just steps of how we got to the finished product. As far as programming goes, since this is also in this point on the rubric, I'll start with our nuke match autonomous entry. We start with a bit of planning as well, and describe potential routes that we may be choosing to program, including a flowchart so that the logic of a route is easy to see and understand for the judges, ports initialization, and then fully commented code for that section. We make sure to split it up fairly well, just so that it's relatively easy to understand. It's not just pasting code. And we thoroughly comment just to make up for a lack of text explanation here. You could kind of go either way on terms of explaining it here or explaining it here. We just choose to do comments in the code itself. Next, we'll move back into the testing section. 79. So we do have some larger testing entries in the notebook that are just testing specifically, but for the most part, our testing is sort of interwoven in with other entries, both build and brainstorming. So this is just a fairly simple testing entry from the end of an intake building design and build intake from our first robot. So the first thing we do is kind of describe our testing and make sure to have a clear procedure. If you look at the testing point on the rubric, all it asks for is the steps and then the step results. So we include our steps here, just nice and clearly so that it's easy to read and identify. From there, we just have our results. And then scrolling down, we have a bit of explanation of our results. Our main goal with our testing entries wasn't necessarily to have the most in-depth testing, although we do have some testing entries that are considerably more filled with depth than this one is. We mainly wanted to just make sure our procedure was as clear as possible and then show that we're using testing in different phases of our design process, just to show that we're consistently thinking about if the mechanisms we build will actually work. But following the testing portion on the rubric, we have the record of team and project management. So I'll skip to one of those entries now. So this is an entry type called the task and timeline update. We include one of these for every month across both competition and skills. And this entry serves to just update the reader on the timeline of where we are and kind of what's happened. So we start each off with a recap of the previous month. This mainly just goes into what's actually happened, why are things where they are. Following that, we have a task breakdown of what needs to be completed still in the current month, as well as a Gantt chart based on those tasks. So this is mainly to help with time management and that portion of the rubric. Following that, on page 291, we have the start of our general meeting log. So these entries also serve to kind of hit the record of team and project management in terms of team meeting notes, specifically goals, decisions, and accomplishments. So you'll see we have weekly goals and to-do lists, meeting accomplishments, and progress summaries, purely to just hit that point on the rubric. These are just summaries of real team meetings we did, formatted to kind of hit the rubric a bit better than just a list of what happened at a meeting. All these things were discussed, it's just different formatting. We don't take specific steps to hit other points on the rubric. They're kind of just fulfilled naturally in our notebook as we make progress. So I'll kind of go into a bit of detail on the rest of them just to cover what exactly we do to really help those out. So the first step is to repeat the design process. This one we don't do anything super specific for. We include the design cycle in the beginning in the table of contents, as well as at the start of each robot entry. Once I scroll down to that, see we have design cycle 1 here for the game analysis, because that applies to both. Then once we get further down to the competition robots, you'll see that every entry will have a design cycle indicator. This just shows that we're repeating in the macro scale with different design cycles, but that also helps with our consistency with templates. By using these templates, we're consistently using the same steps throughout the entire notebook. Our brainstorming entries have 3 solutions and are consistent throughout. We have decision matrices in every brainstorming entry. So that way the judges can see that we don't just use decision matrices once at the start and then never again. By using templates to help organize our work, we just consistently hit the same points every time. Some entries are definitely better than others, and we definitely have weaker entries in our notebook, but by using templates, they're not going to dip below the standards of the rubric necessarily, to a point where there's some variation in our entries, but generally not too much variation. That really just kind of helps to repeat the design process in terms of making sure we repeat it on a micro scale through each entry, and on a macro scale by having multiple design cycles indicated. The next step on the rubric is innovation and originality. We're not necessarily sure of specific steps to take at this point. The main thing we do to just hit this point is to conduct our own independent testing, as well as our own brainstorming. We make sure not to explicitly say we're going to whole count somebody, just because that's not very innovative or original. But by including our testing in the brainstorming, this potentially gives us a better shot at a more innovative approach. For usability and completeness, This point is mainly just representative of the detail in the notebook as well as the overall organization. We ensure that a fair amount of detail is recorded in our notebook. As you can see, we have detail in here. While it could be better, it is definitely to a point where I would say it is relatively complete. As well as usability. While Notebook doesn't have a lot of customizability features, that's probably one of the weaker points of Notion, it does have a clean enough aesthetic to where our entry templates make it relatively easy to read. We ensure that everything has bolded highlights, so that way the judges are easily able to identify the key information we want to convey. It just makes it a bit easier to read. With the rubric points out of the way, I want to talk about our main points of improvement throughout the notebook and areas we think are the weakest right now, just so people don't fall into similar pitfalls if they decide to go for a similar notebook. So first, looking at our brainstorming entries, the area we think we can improve in the most here is just to include more detail overall. While we do hit the 3 possible solutions required in the rubric, and they are described relatively well, we feel like we could include more detail for each of these solutions. The testing definitely helps here, but it's not something we can do for every possible solution. As well as it's not necessarily brainstorming, to where we feel like having better or more detailed explanations of each possible solution would help us out more in brainstorming. For build and programming, once we get to build, we feel like our biggest area for improvement would be better pictures. Our pictures are definitely the weakest point here, in that they don't necessarily show the step-by-step process super well. Going back for next season, we would be sure to take better pictures of each kind of step by step, rather than just trying to find pictures we took that fit the steps as well as we could. For programming entries, while we think the quality of our programming entries is pretty solid, we would like to include more of them next season in the notebook. For testing entries and testing generally, more depth here, I think I mentioned that earlier, but having more depth to our testing would be very nice. I am happy with the frequency of our testing and where it is in the notebook as of right now, but having more testing in terms of tests, different tests, and just more useful tests would probably be the way to improve this section the most. And then for team and project management, we would like to include more resource management of like physical resources. Things like 3D printer filament for VEX2, budgeting, parts allocation. Something that I wouldn't say is necessarily as applicable to VEX2, given that there is no limit, would be a plastic breakdown for high school. Is just a nice way to really hit that point. But that's something I feel like our notebook could improve on the most. So with that out of the way, thank you all for watching. Thank you to the team for the work on this notebook. The entire team did a great job with this. We're very proud of our work. Please feel free to reach out in the comments with any questions. And yeah, thank you for watching.